Now, here's the part where you have a choice to make. If you're having technical difficulties, use the chat button at the bottom of the screen, and to interact with Drew, who will help you with whatever problems you're having. If you've got comments or questions, use the Q&A panel, and we'll be gathering those questions for the Q&A that's going to happen between each group of panelists. And we're going to have further Q&A at the end of the panel presentations. And we'll review those questions. We'll get as many of them into the discussion as possible. And any that are not answered in the Zoom meeting, we'll answer offline, and everyone will get an answer to their questions or their comments. So we appreciate that. And then I think it's always good at the beginning of a symposium like this to just review the mission of the Council for Watershed Health, which is to advance the health and sustainability of our region's watersheds, rivers, and habitats, both in natural areas and urban neighborhoods. We do this through science-based research, education, and inclusive stakeholder engagement. The Council defines watershed health as the art and science of protecting, restoring, and managing water and ecosystems to provide biodiversity benefits, social equity, and wellness. And I hope today you'll see that we live up to that mission. So let's go to the next slide, which is a review of I'm going to just wait for that next slide to come up, but it's a review of the 3 panels in this series. The first one, panel 1, we held back in September. It focused on indices, metrics, and monitoring data, the tools that really inform project management, project planning, and design processes. We're going to get a recap of what happened during panel 1 from our executive director, Eileen Alduenda. Today's panel is going to focus on collaboration and coordination with communities on green infrastructure projects. This is, while our first panel had a very high level, big picture view of the data associated with green infrastructure, today we're going to get into implementation issues and one of the most important and critical elements of the process, community engagement. So that's the focus of today's panel. I will go to the next slide, please, and just look at the agenda quickly. Before I get into this too far, I do want to thank the Autry Museum of the West. They were originally going to host this symposium, and obviously we were unable to do that face to face. Nevertheless, we really appreciate their support, and we hope you will support them as well. Last Monday was Indigenous Peoples Day, and if you want to go to a place or visit a website that does a really good job of bringing together sort of the natural history and the cultural history of the Los Angeles River Basin, you want to go to the Autry Museum of the West site and visit in person when you can. I want to just go through the timing of this. We're in the welcome and panel introduction. We've got 6 panelists today, and as you can see, not a lot of time. So what we've done is we've grouped the 6 panelists into 2 presentations each. Each pair has a general theme, and following each pair of presentations, we'll open a brief discussion among all 6 panelists, including taking some selected questions that we get in the Q&A window. I have to say that to get through this in the time we've got, we'll really have to stick to the time schedule, because following these panels, we're really fortunate to have LA County Supervisor Sheila Kuehl as a keynote speaker. And we want to be sure that we're wrapped up with these presentations when she arrives at around 11 o'clock. Then following her keynote address, we've got some poster sessions in breakout rooms, and we'll transition from a webinar format in Zoom to a interactive breakout room format that will allow you to interact with one another and with our poster session presenters. And we've got a great group of posters that we'll talk about, you'll get more information on later in the program. So with that, let's go to our next slide. This is an important, this is very important for us to acknowledge how much we appreciate the partners and sponsors who make these symposia possible. Special thanks go to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the Los Angeles LA Sanitation and Environment, LA County Public Works, Jacobs, the Scotts Miracle Grow Foundation, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and Southern California Edison. And I also want to thank the other sponsoring organizations and companies who have generously sponsored this event, and many of whom we've collaborated with on projects over the years. And we really appreciate their shared commitment to improving the health of our watersheds. So sincere thanks from everyone at the Council for Watershed Health to those sponsors. Before I turn this over to Eileen to make the introductions of the panels, I do want to mention that next year we will be celebrating 25 years since Dorothy Green convened water leaders in Los Angeles to create this organization that could help break down the silos and barriers between agencies, industry, and the public. The goal was to sustainably manage our stormwater and water supplies while conserving, protecting, and restoring our ocean and beaches, rivers, and streams. I read our mission, and we've convened the experts here today from diverse fields, including all of the expertise we have among our participants, to reflect what we've learned and to continue the legacy that Dorothy Green established 25 years ago. So with that, those opening remarks, I want to turn over the introductions of our panelists to Eileen, our executive director. And first, Eileen, I have to ask you, did I leave anything out?
No, I think you're good. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, I'm going to try to say that opening phrase during your, I'll go on mute and learn how to say the opening phrase correctly. Okay, I'm just kidding. It's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I think we can move on to the next slide. Great. Well, I'm really thrilled to have all of you here today joining us. It's been an interesting experience going from in-person to online, and we're eager to have that opportunity to meet with all of you in person, but this is working pretty well. It's allowed us to reach out and include folks that we couldn't before. So to get us started, we had a wonderful panel of presenters back in, well, a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to share some of the takeaways from that panel. For those of you that weren't able to attend, know that we will have the panel recording available, and we have a highlight video that I hope you'll have a chance to take a look at, and that'll be available on the Symposium webpage. Our first panel focused on the benefits of green infrastructure projects and the frameworks and indices, metrics, and tools that are helping us inform project planning and the design of the projects for various benefits. And those benefits are many. We did start off with Elmer Avenue, which is this picture here, which has helped to inform that next generation of green infrastructure projects and the nature-based solutions that we're all eager to see in our communities. And our presenters were diverse. We had Urelia Sanchez from the Council for Watershed Health, who had completed a survey in partnership with Trust for Public Land to get a better sense of what we are monitoring. And we learned that some of the data that was collected from the green infrastructure projects don't always line up with the intended benefits. So there's more lessons to be learned there. We were fortunate to have Sarah Derringer with the Pacific Institute share their approach to addressing multiple benefits in project design by a framework that they've developed, and that will be available on our website for you to learn more about. And she presented some really interesting case studies of how that framework is being utilized. So I encourage you to learn more about their efforts. Sophie Parker with the Nature Conservancy shared their planning tool at looking at multiple benefits and how that can inform where we locate projects to gain the greatest ecological and the community benefits. And then Moss DeJury with LA Sand and Environment. We were fortunate to learn about the biodiversity index that the city is now using to inform where they are putting their projects and how to plan for biodiversity in our urban landscape where we need it most. And Isaac Brown with Stillwater Sciences worked with Moss on that biodiversity index and really gave us a sense of how we can use that index to identify not just the project locations, but what species we need to be keeping in mind as we design our projects. And those are species that are both for plant and animal, flora and fauna we want to keep in mind. And we finished up with a presentation from Darla Alswick, who has worked with the council on a number of projects, and she brought her experience working with a number of municipalities on capital projects and how they look at green infrastructure. And then really did a nice job of sharing a number of tools that are being used to calculate the benefits of green infrastructure. So we're in the process of compiling all of their indices and frameworks, the tools and resources that were shared during that first panel into a toolbox of sorts that we'll make available at our last panel on October 29th. We'll make that available on our website and provide links, as well as the poster sessions. We had a number of really wonderful poster sessions, poster presentations that highlighted key projects that I know all of you will want to take a look at. Next slide, please. So how we design our built environment can have a number of beneficial outcomes, and we got a number of those lessons learned from our first panel, and we're going to move into this panel getting a better understanding of what those outcomes mean for the communities that we're working in, where these projects are going, how we're looking at where these projects go. And we're also going to need to be thinking about some of those undesirable or unexpected outcomes for our communities. And as we think about green infrastructure projects and how we integrate them into our communities, we really need to make sure that they're successful in many ways. We all are defining success in a number of different ways, and today's conversation will help us look at what that looks like from the community's perspective, as well as our funders' perspective, agencies, nonprofits. All of that contributes to the success, and it's important that when we go into these project processes that we do have an educated and engaged community to participate in all the project phases, from the project concept development through design, through construction, and certainly after that ribbon has been cut. And all of our presenters today are bringing their perspectives, experience into that perspective. So the council has been engaging with community stakeholders for our own projects, as well as in partnership with agencies and the consultants, and more recently with community-based organizations. And I know we all can agree that this is integral to the success of any green infrastructure project, that we have collaboration amongst all of those project players. And we're seeing a number of different project players, project partners join us today. Can we go to that next slide? So today we're excited, as I mentioned, to have all of you join us, and we have representatives from all of these different groups, and all of them are important. And I know we're probably missing some in terms of who is in the room, and we go back to that question, who isn't in the room, who needs to be involved? It came to mind that we've been talking with ecologists, biologists, we need to add them to this slide. They were certainly part of our conversation in our first panel, and I'm not quite sure how we overlooked including them here, but I know there's others that we're going to want to recognize and include. And we can even break this down in terms of what types of engineering firms, what nonprofit organizations, who in academia. So these are those broad, those broad terms that we want to kind of dig down into and see who else do we need to have in the room that we can look for, including in the processes, and that's what our panel will be talking a little bit more about today. And I do want to applaud all of you that are reaching out to community groups and including them in your project processes. It takes a lot of effort to do that, and a lot of coordination and communication is really key for that. It's not an easy process, and we're hoping that we can learn from our panelists and from each other how to make it a successful process, and then share those lessons learned as well. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll introduce who we have here today. We've invited all of these panelists to share their perspectives on community engagement and the value that community stakeholders bring to that project process. We have Brian Matsumoto with Nature for All. He brings a valuable perspective on community engagement and placemaking, as does Robin Mark with the Trust for Public Land. She's here to share their work of creating much needed parks that are important places in every community. Michelle Romolini with the Center for Urban Resilience at Loyola Marymount University is here to share her research on community decision-making processes and the importance of trees in communities. And that leads us to Rachel Malrich with the City of LA, who has spent much of her career bringing trees into our communities, and she'll share her perspective on the importance of not only trees being integral to our green infrastructure projects, but the importance of collaboration with those that are providing the trees and that are wanting the trees. And trees often are this gateway to talking with communities about green infrastructure projects and about other benefits that trees can provide to communities. And so we've asked Carlos Moran, one of our newest members with the Council for Watershed Health, to share his perspective on other priorities that communities have in mind as they think about projects for their own communities. And then we have Pauline Louie with HUD, and as a former ambassador for the LA River Urban Waters Federal Partnership, she's been working with communities for a number of years in a variety of circumstances, and she'll bring her perspective on some of those interesting opportunities for us to consider as we think about the next iteration of green infrastructure projects. So at this time, I'm going to pass it back to Paul, who is going to get our first set of panelists started, and I'll be back to bring in some of those questions into the discussion. And so I think we're ready to go, Paul.
Thanks, Eileen. So our first two panelists are Brian and Robin, and they're focusing on engaging communities for placemaking and even in broader context. So I'll turn the first presentation over to Brian. We'll hear both presentations, and then we'll have some discussion that I'm wanting all of our panelists to engage in, including asking Brian and Robin any questions. And we'll bring in some questions that we get through the Q&A. So Brian, you're up first. Are you ready?
Yep, great. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Brian Matsumoto from Nature for All, and pleased to be here with you all. Next slide, please. So today I'm here to share with you the work that Nature for All has been doing, really engaging the community on water and green infrastructure through our leadership development courses. The hook for folks in the community is to learn how to advocate for parks, green infrastructure projects in their mostly park poor, underserved communities that we target in the San Gabriel Valley, San Fernando Valley, and Southeast LA. For those of you who don't know, Nature for All is based here in Los Angeles County, and our mission is to ensure that everyone, no matter where we all live, has equitable access to all the benefits that nature provides. And we're involved in policy to increase parks and green infrastructure. So, we've advocated for Measure W, Measure A, in the state, Prop 68 access, as well as in Congress for the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument. So this slide here is last fall in El Monte. I was working on our San Gabriel Valley Leadership Development course, and you can see on the right side kind of our curriculum over 4 different workshops. We cover civics, learning who represents you in government, how to advocate, Measure A, Parks Needs Assessment, specifically Class 3, Measure W, the Safe Clean Water Program. Where does our water come from in LA? Why is it important? And why are we now trying to capture local water? And then I'll show you pictures of our watershed tour. Says I have an echo, but I don't know what to do about that. I apologize if there's an echo. Next slide. So a brief look at what our curriculum looks like in the water section. We deliver this course in Spanish and in English, and over 700 folks over the past 2 years have gone through some form of this course. And now we have 30 ambassadors trained as well to deliver this course in the community. So we're really developing, a diverse generation of environmental leaders out in the community that can really speak for their own communities and try to bring these funds through projects. So, obviously we go through imported water, all the different sources, and the idea of green infrastructure for the community, that this is, kind of a complex issue, but once you start to talk about just, slowing, spreading, sinking it, it really starts to make sense. And we're involved in the Our Water LA Coalition as well, many groups across LA County to advocate on these issues. Next slide. So this was kind of the coolest part. It really comes together when you take folks out to see real places. And so this was our watershed tour up the San Gabriel River watershed. And we start at the bottom in El Monte at a number of stormwater parks built by Amigos de los Rios. We went up to Peck Park, where folks can see the water gathered, and then finally up to the San Gabriel Mountains and the West Fork, which unfortunately probably has been very impacted by the Bobcat fire. But just real moving stories of folks crying, folks that have been living in the San Gabriel Valley for so many decades and have never been to these places. And a lot of local pride came out of this watershed tour as people start to understand that, yes, we really do have wild rivers, and yes, this local water is a fundamental source of our drinking water. Next slide. And so finally, just a personal story of what comes out of our projects. We're also involved in the Safe Clean Water Project WASC committees, like on the Rio Hondo and Upper San Gabriel River. And this example is the Bassett High School multi-benefit stormwater capture project, that like dig up the field, throw in the infiltration galleries, put a park on top of it. As we started to kind of hear about this project from Public Works, from the county, our community participant, Laura Santos, we gathered her in because she's a community member, and she was kind of shocked because she didn't know about it. And she's quite involved in the community. And so we really helped engage Public Works, and she went around and mobilized the school community, the school district, who really wasn't very aware of what was going to be happening on their own property even. Neighbors were not aware of the opportunities of this project coming. So she brought a lot of input, lots of community comment into the process. And I think that the success stories are that this project is now committed with funding, $32 million through the program. And we got a commitment from Public Works to really engage the community a lot deeper because everyone could see that many more folks need to be worked with to make this a success. Yeah, I could go on, but I'm happy to engage in questions after Robin. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. Robin, are you ready to go?
I am. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I am Robin Mark. I'm with the Trust for Public Land. It's nice to be here today. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk you through the Urban Orchard, which is a project we're working on in the city of Southgate. Next slide. So the Urban Orchard, it sits adjacent to the LA River. Southgate's a small community, 100,000 people. Population is about 74% Latinx, and also the city has some of the worst air pollution in the state of California. You can see in this image, the property is basically vacant. It has transmission towers, DWP and Edison towers. Again, you can see the LA River in the background. You can also see the Bandini Channel, which is a stormwater channel that runs through the site. It takes stormwater from a 4,000-acre watershed and dumps it out into the LA River just south of the image that you're seeing right now. In terms of the community, you know, it's really critical for us to be thinking about what needs are in the community. And Southgate really faces incredibly high levels of, like I said, environmental pollution and social vulnerability. And it ranks as one of the most critical for intervention, again, in the state of California. In terms of access to open space, there are no parks or open spaces within a half-mile of this exact site. As we know, the LA River isn't publicly accessible in this area, so we don't count the LA River there. And again, it's a vacant piece of property, so there's a lot of opportunity. Next slide, please. So, you know, this project came to us from the city of Southgate. They were really interested in utilizing the property for community benefit. And, you know, we thought, again, we looked at the opportunity, we looked at the need in the community and thought, we need to start talking to the residents immediately, right? If there's any hope to do it right, we've got to start talking to people immediately. And so we were fortunate enough to have some seed funding to be able to work with a community-based organization who I'm sure you all know from Lot to Spot. It was important for us as we were getting started with our outreach that TPL is not a community-based organization, and one of the best ways to build trust is to work with community-based organizations. And so they helped us develop an outreach plan to get started talking to the community and take their temperature about what they were really interested in. We also, you know, knew from the start, always community engagement is key, but when you're looking at a property that is 30 acres in total, is adjacent to the LA River where we know there's a ton of planning going on, we knew that the impacts in the community were, you know, we're going to be really big, right? So again, bringing the community in from the very outset was of the highest priority. We also were able to have our community organizer, Diana Molina, start sort of augmenting from Lots of Spots engagement and do some one-on-one community and relationship building, again, building trust, which is of the utmost importance, and then also just really establishing personal connections with residents and identifying community leaders. One of the things that I think is really critical, again, as you're thinking about a 30-acre site, you're thinking about community engagement, and then also we're thinking about how to really authentically represent the community's needs with this project, is not just thinking about the project site itself, but thinking beyond that, thinking really holistically about how we can support residents. And so we really started to dive in with residents in some of our engagement about sort of non-traditional questions, not just what sort of amenities do you want, what sort of trees do you want, but you know, what are the things that can really make this space represent you? And you can see some of those questions that we asked community members on this slide, really trying to dig in to how the site could really represent them. Next slide, please. So what does the future look like? Where does all this work get us? You know, so today we're at a point we're still engaging residents. We are actually done with design development, where we should be going out to bid in the next month or two, but keeping residents engaged is really still very critical. We actually have a food giveaway that we are working on this Friday. We'll be delivering food to the residents of the Thunderbird Villa Mobile Home Park, which is just south of the project site. This is a senior living community that has been dramatically impacted by COVID. And so food is really one of the highest priority needs. And so we've got a grant through the LA Regional Food Bank, and we'll be dropping off packages on Friday. But again, continuing to engage the residents beyond just their needs at this park site. What are their current needs? How can we support them holistically? We're also working with the Long Beach Conservation Corps. The Corps is going to have a satellite site at the Urban Orchard. This will help create new jobs in the community, and will also create, having a presence, having a maintenance presence at the site every day really changes the way people feel about going to the site, right? And that was really important to us. All the information we heard from the community about wanting the site to feel safe, wanting the site to be well maintained. So it was really critical too. And I see Dan Knapp is a panelist or is in the room. So hi, Dan, and we're so excited to be working with the Corps on this project. It really, again, speaking to how we can further support the community by just more than just this open space itself. And you can see on the slide, so beyond all of these sort of other things that we were thinking about, the site does include some really exciting green infrastructure work. We have a 1 acre wetland that will be cleaning stormwater from the Bambini Channel. We'll be reusing it for irrigation at the park. We have over 300 trees at the site, some of which are fruit and some of which will help mitigate the pollution coming off the 710 freeway. And some of those other elements you see there. One other element I didn't want to leave out is the honoring of local culture and historic Tongva culture at the site. We will be doing that through native and medicinal plants that will be at the site, signage and art, and also had the opportunity to work with a Tongva elder on the design of the nature-based playground as well. Next slide. So just in terms of what I'd like to leave you all with is, the approach to this work is really about advocacy. I think we all come to our work at TPL from a place of, yes, parks and open space, but also how can parks and open space really serve to support the community beyond kind of the public health benefits that we recognize very clearly are related to parks. And so it's our responsibility to engage the community in authentic ways and really ask those questions that they might not be expecting, and think really holistically about how resources and how benefits can be incorporated into the site. And
thanks, Robin.
I will stop. Yeah.
That's great. That leaves us about 5 minutes or more to take some questions. I first open this up just to the other panelists. Any questions or comments come to mind after those two great presentations? I do have, let me start with one question for Brian, because I was very impressed by the way you plugged in a community member into a project that benefited from additional community involvement. Is this a new role really for the kind of advocacy group that you're creating, sort of bringing people up to speed on how to participate in projects like Robin is undertaking?
Yeah, definitely, Paul. I think we do find ourselves trying to fill that gap as a nonprofit. Obviously, I think we would hope the agencies and cities would do this work, as including education of community members into, say, the Safe Clean Water program and that kind of thing. It's supposed to be in there, but there's so much work to be done, and often it's so brief, like tied to a project, that there's a lot of base building that needs to be done ahead of time. So a lot of folks are doing this similar type of work. Tree People, Pacoima Beautiful, Active SGV. I think through the state Prop 1, there was some water talks education that kind of formed a model like this. And it's a really great way to engage community members in learning about where does their water come from, this fundamental resource, and then start tying it to how can all these exciting sustainable movements create park space in your community. One thing I will say is that we're kind of also in like a watchdog role kind of pushed to be, because Measure W, all our organizations through Our Water LA really fought hard to make sure that the disadvantaged communities and equity measures were built into that measure. But then it just doesn't stop with the policy being created. Now that the projects are starting to be implemented, everyone needs to be there every step of the way to make sure that actually happens.
Thank you, Brian. This is a really interesting relationship that is being created between a community that you're educating and providing a lot of information to, and projects like Robin's. I would just ask you, Robin, how did you reach out to the community affected? Did you go to some existing community-based organizations as a way of sort of getting to a larger group of people without having to start from scratch?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, so, as with any project, we do asset mapping, right? What are the existing resources in the community that we can tie into churches, schools, the mobile home park, for example, places where people are naturally going to go anyway? How can we tie into some of the programming that they already have to reach out to the community? And as I mentioned, we did work with From Lot to Spot in the early days of outreach in 2017 to get established. One of their organizers actually had lived and worked in Southgate, and so really understood where, kind of the on the ground perspective of living in Southgate and where people were going to go, help best to actually get their attention. One of the other things that I just wanted to pick up on that Eileen had mentioned in her intro was about trees sort of being this gateway to talking with community members about green infrastructure. And I could not agree more. I mean, we have found on multiple projects that when you start people, I think, sort of immediately understand the benefit of trees, right? It's much more tangible than I think stormwater management, right? It's easier to make a connection to it. And so that was one of the early ways that we started talking with folks about the urban orchard. It's the urban orchard, right? So we started initially talking about fruit trees. What kind of fruit trees do you want in your community, right? And from there, we were sort of able to expand onto the wetland, native fish, native plants, those sorts of things.
Thank you. Eileen, anything, I think we get one more question, but it'd be great if we could take one from the Q&A panel.
Yeah, and I think Robin probably touched on this in terms of what was one of the biggest concerns that was raised from the residents around Southgate, and then there was one for Brian. I don't know which one we should take. Maybe we should kind of end on urban orchard, and then we can come back to all these other questions
at the Q&A at the end. We can come back. We can come back. We won't lose any of these questions.
Yeah. So Robin, maybe if you could just kind of end on like how, what was that biggest concern among the residents, and maybe how did you address that?
So the biggest concern is not specific to the urban orchard. It's in any park project that we work on, is safety. People, there's naturally a fear of change. And I think when you take a site like the urban orchard that's been vacant forever, I think it was a landfill in 1900, and that's really the last time it was utilized as a site, which we're mitigating for. But people are scared to see what's going to happen there. The site is not easily accessible currently. It will be in the future, but it isn't now. And so again, that's where bringing in that resource of the Conservation Corps really comes in. They lend an element of maintenance, keeping the site clean, and then also just having folks be there. If I'm a mom, if I bring my child in the middle of the day and I see that there are people working at the site, I immediately feel safer than if I were just all by myself in a giant orchard in the middle of the city. So again, we are grateful to our core partners in this effort.
Thank you, Robin. Unfortunately, given the time, we got to push on to the next panel, but you gave us a great segue, Robin, because the next two panelists are going to be focused on, I guess we'll have to call it now, the gateway green infrastructure, trees. And our next two panelists, are you ready to go? And we're going to start with Michelle.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Romolini. As you can see, the Managing Director of the Center for Urban Resilience at Loyola Marymount University. And I'm very, very honored to be here among all of you. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit of a bridge between, I think, what was on the first day of the symposium and what we're talking about today. So really bringing the data to the community for decision making. So be a little bit of data, but really how we're using those data to engage the community. So we can start next slide. Thank you. So our center, the Center for Urban Resilience, or our acronym CURES, we use our science really to produce ecology for cities, which is a way of thinking about doing science in service to the community that you're researching. So it's called use-inspired research. Really, what is going on in the community? What are the questions the community has? And how can we use sound data to help inform decision making? So our focus areas, you can see them there. I think really where I'm going to drill in is our green infrastructure and society and the environment research areas. We would consider this project to fall under both of those. And then, as I'm saying, you know, all of our work really engages the community. Of course, our undergraduates and other programs on campus, but locally and regionally, nationally and internationally. So the project I'm going to talk about has roots in the National U.S. Forest Service. That's who I was trained under as a PhD student. And through some of our coursework, we really developed this process that I'm going to talk about. So next slide, please. So how this project starts is by producing high level, high accuracy, high resolution tree canopy data. And the way that we do that is in partnership with the folks who developed this process at the University of Vermont. And we start with a high resolution image, right? Like this one. Next slide. We overlay what's called LiDAR data that gives you a 3D image of the heights of all of the land cover. Next slide. And those two together through a process called object-based image analysis produces this really highly accurate, in the high 90% accuracy, which is really high compared to some previous work that was used to categorize land cover in national forests, where it's okay if you make some mistakes, you know, you can be a little off, but when we're planning for urban tree canopy, we want to think down to that parcel. And so, so this land cover map can be the foundation then to guide decision making. So you can see there's 8 categories. Tree canopy is one of them, but the grass, the bare soil, the water, the building, the roads, the rail, the other paved and the shrub, they all actually play into the tree canopy analysis, which this is the foundation for. So next slide. So this is just that same image. You can go to the next slide. What we do is we overlay a parcel map, and then the next slide. So that land cover, that tree canopy land cover is summed up to the parcel level. So you can see percent cover for all of the parcels in a given geography. We have data for all of LA County. So you can see at the parcel level, you can see in your backyard how much tree canopy exists. We found 26% in the city, which we think is skewed a little high because it includes some of the Santa Monica Mountains, and 18% canopy cover existing countywide. Next slide. So then the other side of this analysis is possible tree canopy. So where there may not be existing canopy, it's not always necessarily possible to plant, right? Because you could have a building that's lot line to lot line. Obviously, roads and those types of areas are not possible to plant. So this map shows the percent possible. And so that can then start to guide where trees could be planted. Possible includes grassy areas, bare soil, and then there's also possible impervious, which could be schoolyards or parking lots that may be able to be broken up in the future. But so we have all these great data, right? But we don't necessarily know what's preferable for a community. We're not going to make that decision. We can offer these data, but the next step is to understand what's preferable. So next slide, please. So really then the exciting part to me about this project is getting the data into the community, into community-based decision-making. And that we do that through a process called tree canopy prioritization. We go through an exercise at the city level where we meet with officials from different departments, and we ask them, what are your priorities that trees can help address? What are your priorities for, sustainability and parks and rec? But also, what are your priorities for public health, for housing, things that may not necessarily always be considered, right? Because trees are the gateway. Or as my PhD advisor said, the greatest multitaskers. So in Commerce, we found 5% existing canopy. So remember, that was 18% countywide. So now you're really looking at this low level comparatively to the rest of the county. But we also saw 51% possible. And so we engaged the local municipality first and talked to different leaders, the city manager and others in city government. And then we developed a survey to bring to the residents and community members. We worked with tree people to do this work, as well as the City of Commerce. And tree people reached out to other community groups that they were partners with. And you can see in this survey, it's pretty small on the screen, but basically every single one of these choices are benefits of trees, but those benefits are then tied into a spatially available variable, right? So there's data behind it that then we can use to overlay on the landscape. So we use the possible tree canopy as the basis, then we overlay the community priorities on top. Next slide. And that then produces a, combining all of the priorities that were voted on by community members at a in-person meeting, which we won't be able to do probably for this next round, but we then produce a priority map, and that's really based on the input of those who came to the meeting, those who were engaged by tree people outside of the meeting and other groups. And now the city has this guide of where they can start planting trees once they begin, based on community input. And you can see we partnered again with City of Commerce and Tree People, and Edison International funded this pilot. And now we have received additional partnerships to continue this work in the gateway cities. So with that, I will end. Sorry if I took a few extra minutes. Oh, Paul, I think you're muted.
Sometimes I'm better muted. This is a great segue to Rachel's presentation. I really love Rachel's title as City Forest Officer for Los Angeles Bureau of Street Services. And when I mean, you do your presentation, I'll come back and we'll talk.
Sounds good. I'm
Thanks,
actually
Rachel.
within the Department of Public Works, not within Streets Division. But
sorry.
I'm very excited to be in my current role as City Forest Officer for the City of LA, and super thrilled to be here talking about community engagement in these projects. And I'm just marveling a little bit this morning at how far we've come and how far this conversation has evolved over the past 5 or 6 years. I feel like while it still needs to be so top of mind for us, I feel like I'm seeing more and more projects that are taking this seriously, and that makes me really happy, because my time prior to being with the city, I was in the nonprofit sector for about 12 years, focused on community engagement and building projects that were based in community needs and desires. So next slide. So I'm going to start off with listening. When we're doing community engagement around these projects, we need to listen first, second, third, fourth, fifth. I mean, it needs to be an ongoing and iterative process as we're developing projects, and really listening with the intention to, come from a place of not knowing anything. Even if we've spent time in the community, I think it's really important to come with no assumptions about what they want or need, and start by just hearing what the needs are in the community, even if our project isn't going to meet those. And then again, getting that feedback throughout the process, which we've already heard through the 2 really fantastic projects we heard at the top of our panel discussion. As part of that listening, I'll just add that using local trusted messengers like Robin talked about in her presentation is so key. It takes time to build relationships and trust in communities. And so as much as we can leverage those local partners that have that trust already in the community, it's really helpful as much as we can do that. And I'll add that we need to do a good job on both the project side and on the community side of building an understanding. So what I frequently see is that when we go in, obviously listening first to the community, but there's a lack of understanding sometimes of the perspective of a city employee. So on the city side, there are limited resources for operations and maintenance, as we all know, and there's a real responsibility to deal with risk. And so that's going to be, you know, one of our arborists that work for the city, they're going to come and look at a space and make decisions on trees based on that understanding of needing to protect the public. And sometimes, again, I don't think it's just important to make sure our community members know that that's kind of one of the lenses that we're bringing to the project while we're doing that authentic listening. There needs to be an understanding that that's a component of the city's role and how they're approaching the project. And then on the flip side, city staff don't always remember that the community members are the ones looking at it day in and day out. And again, our previous presenters showed how much you can develop projects with that community lens in mind, but we have to remember that the tree that may be removed or planted is something that someone's going to look at every day. And so they have a strong feeling about it. It's a backdrop of their lives. And so that's really important. Next slide, please. As has already been emphasized, trees are superheroes. They do a number of things that are really important, and they are way more tangible for folks. And I would say that I see fruit trees as the real gateway to even talking about trees. So I love that Robin included those in her project, because fruit trees really are a starting point. And part of the reason that trees are more tangible is not only because people can be involved in their installation and have that opportunity to have some agency in a project, but everybody has a tree story, and that goes back to our listening, and it may be positive or negative, either a tree that's damaged, you know, or perceived to be damaging the pipes, you know, going into their home, or lifting the sidewalk, or, you know, that memory of having fruit trees in the backyard where they could go out and pick fruit as a child. So everyone has a tree story, and I think that's part of the reason that they are a really great gateway to talking about water. Next slide, please. I will say that not all trees are created equal. So if anyone's heard me speak recently, they're going to hear me saying what I say now, which is that we need to find more ways that we can be planting large stature trees. So this image, Western redbud only grows to 20 feet tall at its mature size. Jacaranda 50 feet, California sycamore 80 feet. But the benefits that they provide are exponential, and yet they cost me the same amount to plant. They all come in a 15-gallon. They all need 3 to 7 years of establishment care. We really need to be investing in opening up more spaces and having adequate soil volumes for large stature species. And then there are other criteria that come into play when we pick trees. But that's my main pitch. If I can get anyone to remember anything, try and find more spaces for trees that will be big at their mature size. And that's all I have.
Ooh, big trees.
Mute. There we go. Rachel, thank you. Let me ask in this round. Let me ask Eileen if there's any. We've got a lot of questions in the Q&A panel. Is there one or two questions we could start off from the participants this time? And you're on mute.
Oh, thanks for the reminder about the mute. I'm sure there's questions that are forming for folks
Okay.
in terms of this, but I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A right now, but I'll keep my eye open.
So then let me ask the other panelists, any questions from the other panelists?
Yeah, hi, Paul. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Pauline. Let's hear from you.
All right, thanks. Yeah, this question is for Rachel, actually. And I love this kind of last slide that you have here. How do we educate kind of the community to kind of understand getting past maybe just the aesthetics of like, wow, that redbud is really pretty, or the jacaranda is so pretty when it blooms, to really understanding some of that you can have beauty and function?
Yeah, and I think that it really comes down to understanding the site. Anytime that we're selecting trees, we're looking at all the components of the space, and part of those site criteria are the desires and needs of the community. And so again, you can make a project that maybe is multi-layer. You know, you might have some flowering trees or ornamental trees that are part of a project, but we should start first by looking at the trees that are going to provide the most benefits. And honestly, not only is the aesthetics an important component, but for a lot of folks in certain communities, there is a real like trepidation to having big trees. There's some nervousness around that. And so I think having the conversation around those benefits, but really connecting it to things that matter to folks, whether it be, you know, lower asthma rates or public health, which again, I think Carlos is going to get into a little bit, but and that's the thing they can be talking about, the impacts it has on local commerce or safety. I mean, again, trees have a number of angles we can talk from. Really understanding what the community cares about is important. What is the benefit that means the most to them? And then how can we then talk about the tree selection process through that lens?
Any other questions from other panelists? Maybe I would ask you, Rachel and Michelle, does the kind of analysis, Rachel, that Michelle is doing, does that look like a tool that you would or will use?
You know, the LiDAR project in general was a bit earth-shattering, for me at least, when they first presented the data. It's really just fantastic. We can see at the parcel level, which makes it so that when we're looking at the mayor's equity goal of increasing canopy by 50% by 2028, we can say, well, what neighborhoods have room for trees right now without us making any policy or infrastructure changes? Though I do want to say that if we're going to get to some canopy targets in these neighborhoods, we're going to have to make some significant changes that are going to be hard and expensive. But in the meantime, we can say, okay, when we're doing our tree distributions for private property, when we're doing the deep education about where people should plant and what kind of trees and how to do that with the least amount of damage, we can start by saying, okay, what neighborhood has, you know, parcels with room for canopy, which is a little big brothery. So I feel a little weird about it, but it allows us to really target our efforts on communities, because outreach is really expensive, you know, in terms of the time spent to build those relationships, to get a hold of people who are in their homes, being able to target those resources in a way that's going to give us the biggest benefit because we know where the resources could go is really helpful.
Michelle, did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, I was just going to echo that, and how excited I was as a student to see that this, you know, highly technical analysis had such real impact and real applications on the ground. And I moved to LA in 2013, and I have been really trying to get these data into the hands of people who would use them since then. And so this has been such an exciting process. It's a hard thing to get funded. And so I'm incredibly grateful to Edison for taking the shot on funding a community-based prioritization. And it's exciting to start to see the data get into the hands of lots of different, the city and other places.
Brian, your hand up.
Yeah, since Michelle mentioned funding, I think that's a perfect question. You know, Robin really mentioned how important it is for either these cities or agencies to partner with community-based organizations, right? But often the struggle is there is so little budget allotted for community engagement, if at all. And so I think historically, that's why you see kind of on the spectrum of how good community engagement could be, like this low level, like this is what we're doing, do you have any input? You know, and then in the middle is more of like, let's really engage the community, and at the end is let's really empower the community. So I'm curious to find out if, I think overall there's more and more focus on community engagement, which is great. If we could see the budgets for that increasing as well, that's how we're going to get real movement on that. Are you all seeing support for that within your agencies and work?
I'll take a stab at answering that. I mean, I couldn't agree more, Brian. It is the community engagement piece is the hardest to fund, and it is the most critical to successful work. I think we all know that. And so, you know, I think we are seeing some movement. I think there are, I think the philanthropic community is leading it. I think you're right, Michelle. Edison has definitely shown an interest in community engagement. They helped fund the community engagement we did on the Urban Orchard. And so we wouldn't have been able to do it without them. So I think the philanthropic community is leading. What I would love to see is on the public funding side, some grant programs will support community engagement to a certain extent. It always has to tie back to the direct project. And I think that's the limitation, right? We should be able to engage residents on a whole host of issues to ensure the success of a project. And so I would like to see a bit more flexibility around that because you cannot, again, underplay the importance and the critical nature of the engagement.
And
Rachel?
I'll add that, you know, the 2 to 3 year grant period that we have for these projects is not long enough to build a relationship. And so you have to have made that investment up front, which is what they're looking for when you're applying, is that shovel ready project where you already have the community buy-in. But at the same time, again, it's so expensive for groups to spend that time building those relationships. It's time consuming, and yet we can't skip it if we want to have successful projects that the public utilizes and feels really good about and reflects the kind of neighborhoods that they want to see.
So I have there's a question that's kind of brewing there's a couple of things that come to mind, and I want to ask about this because it's around the community engagement that has to happen before the projects are actually funded. And this is something, Paul, we talked about with the last panel, and that there's this interesting balance. And I'm wondering how all of you are thinking about this and kind of planning for it, because you do need that community engagement as you're planning for those projects without being assured that you're going to have the funding to actually implement the project. So how do we balance out setting expectations for a project that haven't yet been funded? And what are we thinking about there? And certainly it goes back to needing more funding to support the community engagement. I'm curious, sort of, how are you all thinking about it? Because it's been on our mind a lot.
Well, and that's part of the terrifying thing, right? You might engage the community, get them really excited about something, and then say, fingers crossed, maybe we'll get funded. And that's really, yeah, I sympathize wholeheartedly. If others have thoughts, I think that it's about building the conversation using all of our resources from our various angles to continue the conversation about the importance of these projects. Luckily, new funding streams have opened up with Measure W and other things, but yeah. Great question.
Yeah, I agree. That's really a challenge. And like with Measure W, you see that where folks who are just trying to bring in a proposal need to have done community engagement. And right, you don't want to overcommit or burn relationships with folks. So I think that's why we try to use those opportunities as education. So, you know, if folks in the community can come away having learned what green infrastructure looks like at other parks and come away with a vision of like, well, this is what I want to advocate for, no matter if they get this funding for this specific project, folks come away knowing like what they want in their community and can push for that going forward. At least we're building that base of education in the community, and that's what we want to do.
Yeah.
Sorry, no, Michelle, you go.
Well, I just really wanted to echo and emphasize the importance of partnering, because we all have different goals or complementary, but different goals for a lot of these projects. And what I've found to be the most beneficial, and it takes time, right? Because like I was saying, I've been here 8 years, and I started building relationships with a lot of different experts and professionals, like this amazing people on this panel. And so with this project that I was presenting about, Tree People had some funding to actually plant trees in Commerce. And, you know, we had the funding, we had already funded the data. Then we found some funding for the community engagement piece. And Tree People helped us do the community engagement piece, but we had to hire a technical person. So it's this interesting piecing together, and it's really hard work to do that. But there's such value in partnering and not saying, okay, well, I'm the scientist. Nobody's going to care if I come into the community. They're not going to listen to me. And so those partnerships are really important.
And I think not starting from scratch along those same lines of, I know that I participated in some processes where there was some planning fatigue in communities going like, I've already talked to these 3 other entities about my goals and desires for the community. So finding ways to do the soft ask. I know on one of the projects I did at Koreatown Youth and Community Center, we started with the council office field deputies. And we're like, what streets are you getting the most complaints on where we could focus on a project? Let's start there. And then we went to the community and said, okay, we heard that the Vermont the Western corridor was the one that you care the most about because there's a lot of nuisance businesses. What kind of trees would you want to see there? And so kind of starting with, again, those local partners where you can ask some questions without making some splashier promises. And trees, again, being a gateway where they're a less expensive item than some of these bigger infrastructure projects as a starting point. And that was one of the things we did in Huntington Park, is partnering with Communities for a Better Environment when I was at Tree People. They're looking at long-term air quality and pollution and those kinds of things, but doing a tree planting with the neighborhood was a way for them to improve the air quality and have a hands-on moment while working on this advocacy side long-term.
All right, I tell you what, let's move to our third panel, after which we can have an extended Q&A, and we'll bring in some of the questions that we're collecting in the Q&A from the participants as well. And Carlos, I think you're up first.
All right, good morning, everyone. It is good to be here with this panelist and with all of you in the audience. I see some very good friends, some Tree People families. Shout out to LAUSD who's on here, all our CBOs and partners, and just, you know, those from with agencies, whether you're with the city or the county and water agencies. I'm going to be talking to you today, or just kind of sharing my thinking, you know, and on the intersectional approach to green infrastructure investments, and kind of like in the background thinking about community health, and not just public health or mental health or environmental health, but just in general, like neighborhood level health. So my perspective is from being an MSW, being a social worker, being a master's of having a master's in social work, and looking at these. You know, we have two pillars in our profession where we look at the person and environment perspective, and then we also look at intersectionality. And so those two perspectives, and, you know, having the background in neighborhood redevelopment, homelessness, eviction prevention, mental health, substance abuse, foster youth, working with families, at-risk youth, having all of that background as a social worker, and then coming into the working in the environmental space has allowed me to really hone in on that intersectionality, not just the needs, but also the strengths, and where all these different dimensions can converge and really create some large scale impact. So I'll be sharing with you some of that. So on the next slide, it's just kind of a brief visual on intersectionality. And here, typically intersectionality, we think about it like, or its foundation as it being a very personal, individual perspective, you know, the intersection of our race, identity, gender, age, and all kinds of other things, right? But I want to walk you through this process of pulling it out and taking it to a neighborhood level, you know, where we look at housing and food insecurity, at health, economic, and education disparities. You know, let's look at the burdens of climate change, the burdens of access to nature, the burdens of, you know, access to green space. You know, and at this neighborhood level, we also look at the alarming rates of mental health in certain communities, the alarming rates of substance abuse, incarceration, right? At the alarming rates of community-wide trauma, intergenerational trauma. I know Anne is in the audience, and you know, shout out to Mansonar Diverted. She's doing a great job in producing this film that's really bringing out the story of intergenerational trauma that has, you know, making that connection of internment camps in Manzanar to Owens Valley and their connection to water, and kind of like this intergenerational approach of justice. You know, we're looking at these different intersections at the neighborhoods level as not acting independently of one another, right? These dimensions interrelate. So when we engage communities, we should, you know, oftentimes it's been my experience on the environmental side where we're looking at it from, you know, park or a different silo of having a green space or access to nature or a water infrastructure project. But oftentimes we miss this opportunity of looking at that interrelatedness. Now, all of this stuff creates, when we look at this, this creates a heavily burdened ecosystem. So what does that ecosystem, what does that community reflect, right? It reflects the intersection of inequities. It reflects the intersection of these varying inequities. And so when we bring assets to the community, or when we engage and involve and empower communities to build assets, we have to acknowledge all of the different needs in that community. Now, also, I want to just kind of invert that to acknowledge that that we should also not just look at the needs, but also the strengths of the community. With all of these, I can easily just kind of retell you the whole slide from a strengths perspective. The strengths of like food and community gardens that are popping up. How people are conserving water, how they're staying active and producing entrepreneurships in small micro economies in the neighborhoods, and so forth, right? So it's not just, I'm not just trying to drill on the negatives, but also looking at the strengths here. So the takeaway for this slide is that inequity is cumulative, right? And we have to acknowledge that, but strengths are also cumulative. And what we do in our approach and how we address these, it needs to take into consideration the different aspects of the neighborhood's makeup, culture, education, how they recreate, pollutants, health, housing, political system, policing, all of that stuff. Now, if we can get into the next slide and kind of still weaving this collective impact or this intersectionality, we have different silos, right? We have our water agencies, our county agencies, city agencies, NGOs, CBOs, grassroots orgs, all of us, right? And we're all working towards improving communities, but we really are doing it in a way where we're just meeting our own personal objectives and goals. But if we look at just aligning our goals, whether that's everyone really adopting the state's water resiliency plan, or the county sustainability plan, or just everyone kind of collectively aligning and intersecting our objectives, we'd be able to make such a greater impact. Now, I took this slide or this beautiful graphic, I can't take credit from it, but this was taken from a case study in Denver that aligns the public and private organizations towards the common goal of preparing students to meet the workforce demand of Colorado. I study systems and best practices. I teach at USC, so I engage my students in the Masters in Social Work program on these concepts of how they can bring in different entities, align goals, align objectives, and move towards greater impact.
Carlos, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yes, sir. I
think we are on the verge of doing the great shakeout. I don't know how that's probably affecting many participants in the meeting. So we'll just acknowledge that we're not going. I don't know that there's a protocol for doing a Zoom meeting through this statewide
Should
event.
I get under my desk?
I think you should consider, let's do it this way. I think you should consider what you would do right now if you were found yourself in an earthquake. Does anyone have anything to add to this? Because this was not on the agenda.
Well, thank you, Paul.
Yeah, actually, I'm running the drill as we speak in my office right now, remotely. Drop, cover, and hold. That's all you need to know.
Okay, Pauline, you saved the day. Thank you very much. And Carlos, my apologies for the interruption, but I just felt like we needed to acknowledge that.
Hey, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Mike, for bringing that up. Yeah, if it was a real earthquake, the earthquake itself wouldn't apologize. So this is all good.
All right, thank you. Continuing.
Next slide, just I'll provide some examples on two initiatives that I'm a part of. And we'll post the links on the chat so that you can have them and view them at your own. But some of you may be familiar with these two. These two projects are examples that are on path to truly achieving multi-benefits and collectively driving large-scale impact. And shout out to Tree People, because while I was there, I was taking part in the Watts Rising Collaborative. And while I was there, including now with the Council for Watershed Health, we've been working on this Water Talks initiative. Really quick, Water Talk, it is the technical name given to us by our funder, which is Department of Water Resources, is Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program. That is, we as a collective between the partners, we decided to switch that around and reinvent it and call it Water Talks, and not just go and engage disadvantaged communities, but really reframe the thinking. And it's not disadvantaged communities, it's environmentally stressed, economically stressed communities, and engaging them in these pláticas and these talks where we can discuss community needs, community strengths, assess them, and then develop projects out of those. Watts Rising has over 24 different community led partners that are, working on everything from housing to health, anchored with this notion of affordable housing, but also bringing in a lot of different sources of funding and including a lot of urban greening features. And again, this is funded by greenhouse gas reduction dollars, so these are, I encourage you at your own time to look through these two as examples of driving impact. Now that leads me to the last slide, and I know we're running short. I am going to really drive it home with this notion of, having healthy return on investments, making the connection back to water leads to this intersectional approach that ultimately lends itself to a healthy return on investment and healthy, strong, resilient communities. All the benefits that come out of this, whether it's water benefits, workforce development, education through school greening, housing, all of those are really good benefits. And these are directed by, having intentional investments like Measure W or the WHAM effort that the county is leading, the ability to scale, and what does that mean for when we think of green infrastructure? When I say ability to scale, for us to think about distributed projects, right? And the council's work. I mean, we're doing some amazing work, and I'm so happy to be part of this organization because, we're working with CBOs that are unfamiliar with green infrastructure projects, and funding, sharing with them like funding that can be leveraged for other benefits as well. Moving beyond simple outreach and engagement and having, considering outreach and engagement or calling it that, but really what it is you have participants that attended a meeting about your project, right? So it's moving beyond that and moving beyond trusted messengers as well. So not just developing trusted messengers that are working for you, but really looking at ways where community is empowered and water leaders are developed, community leaders are developed, like Brian and Nature for All is doing, to build support and build involvement and build the direction of these projects. One quick thing I wanted to mention.
Okay, Carlos, this has got to be quick.
Okay, you know what? I can bring it up during the Q&A.
Okay, dude, that's perfect. Thank you all. Thanks for that. Pauline, you're going to bring this home, wrap this up with it.
All right, I'm gonna try to land this plane here.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. I'm gonna try. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Council for Watershed Health, and good morning to everybody. Good to see folks kind of meeting new friends and colleagues, as well as saying hi to ones I haven't talked to in a while. I am going to try to wrap up a lot of the things that we've heard today and to be perhaps a little bit provocative. Thank you, Carlos, for your presentation, because that just sets it up, this conversation, perfectly. It's a great segue. And so what I'm going to really try to tackle is all the things that Carlos has talked about. How do we operationalize it? And what is the context that we're going to be working in, the larger context? Because it's easy to kind of come together with folks here. And it's so, I love it whenever I get to engage with all of you, because I feel like, I'm coming to like a family dinner because this is my family. And yet every other day of the week, I'm not with my family. I'm trying to have to, kind of articulate to folks, what do I care about? What are the things that are out there, specifically things that are in our family's world right here, may not be on the consciousness of other people. So let's bring up the next slide here. Let's talk about what everybody else is talking about these days, and to just think a little bit, back up a little bit and say, like, who else do I need to kind of be communicating the values and the benefits of green infrastructure and all the work that we're doing together? Who else do I need to be talking to about this? First of all, I think that we need to kind of acknowledge the climate in which we are having this discussion. The word equity is something that a lot of you, I would say most of you, are working on right now. And certainly it is the buzzword that everybody is talking about, but what does it really mean? And I think that one thing that I wanted kind of just to tease out a little bit is to say, does it mean the same thing for everybody? Everybody may be working towards something similar, but is it the same? And are we speaking in the same language? Certainly, this discussion about equity these days has caused me to kind of have a little bit of a personal reckoning about, what do I know about equity? How am I living that? How am I working that? And I think that it is a healthy place for all of us to kind of say, maybe there's still room for all of us to kind of grow in this discussion. I think all of you will find yourselves somewhere in this little bubble graph, who is a stakeholder. But I want to draw your attention to kind of this definition that dictionary.com, thank you, this particular definition of the word equity. And it gave me an aha moment, especially the phrase ownership and sharing in the future profits or appreciation in value. And that's really what we're after, isn't it? Although sometimes our daily work is about, well, I just need to kind of do my work, do my project, the benefits will speak for themselves. But taking it that last step to say that not only do I want to bring nice things into a community, but I want to change their minds. I want to change their hearts. I want them to have the same ownership of these ideals and these benefits as I do, as my organization does. How do we get there? Next slide, please. So I was talking to Eileen and Drew about this, and I said, I'm going to throw up this graph that's on the right, and it's going to be provocative, right? And we had a lot of good discussion about that. So, hold your angry emails for a little bit. And the point that I want to get with this, and of course, I'm kind of presenting this chart there without context in the study that was embedded into. But what I wanted to kind of demonstrate is that green infrastructure, climate change, ecosystems, healthy ecosystems is not on that chart. It's not. There's a whole bunch of other things that people in urban environments consider to be very important to them, and I would even add onto this list, maybe even health now because of kind of what we're going through right now. But green infrastructure is not on this list. And you may say, well, we have to look at the context and all that. But the point is, there's at least one person out there, one person at the Pew Research Center who thinks this way. And I suspect that there's a lot of people that think this way. So it is meant to be provocative. It is meant for us to kind of step back and to say, all right, well, we know why we want these things, but how do we not only build a constituency for green infrastructure, even doing the community engagement piece, how do we expand the constituency because as what I've heard from my fellow panelists this morning is that there are a lot of challenges. It's expensive, time consuming, takes up a lot of kind of emotional space to kind of do this community engagement, even as we say that it's so important. And yet there are buckets of funding out there. There are other partners with expertise and competencies that are out there that do not think the way that we do not even engage these topics in what they're doing or what they believe are community benefits. I would have to say that my work in Urban Waters Federal Partnership, and I hope that everybody is a part of that partnership, is kind of like that. It's every day like that for me, because coming from HUD and joining Urban Waters Federal Partnership, I'm kind of used to being the odd duck in the room. I'm used to kind of getting the looks to say, like, I don't know why she's here. I don't know why HUD is here. And yet that's the way that I think we should approach this issue, which is how many rooms do we walk into in which people are like, huh, why is he here? Why is she here? What does that topic have to do with what I'm working on? And then our job is to make that connection. So a couple of points, and I know we're short on time here, is to help others to view issues through your lens, right? And vice versa. So helping them to kind of see if they're working on housing, do they understand the value, not only the value in the kind of a general sense, but value to the project and the benefit to the project with green infrastructure. And then vice versa, how much do we understand what drives housing, or what drives public health issues, or what drives transportation projects? That's something that maybe we can probably go a little bit further on. And framing is important, because I know I've read and looked at a lot of stuff that you all are doing in terms of talking about equity or community engagement. And yet since it's framed within green infrastructure, automatically somebody who's not in this field may be like, I don't get it. I'm not engaged. I'm going to drop down to the last one, which is the potluck approach, which I use this analogy in a lot of discussions, and I firmly believe it, maybe because I really love food. I love potlucks, and Thanksgiving is coming up. Maybe it's a good analogy, which is, if everybody brings a dish of creamed corn, although I like to consider that as a, meaning all the top 4 food groups, a meal does not make. So it really requires that everybody's going to bring something to this, and it's to demonstrate how the dish that you're bringing to the dinner really completes everything. Next slide, please. All right, so, Eileen and Drew really wanted me to kind of talk about some of the things that I have observed over the last couple of years in my work, not only in urban waters, but also in HUD, and how much I'm trying to think about the really terrific term that Carlos has brought up, the intersectionality. And Carlos, I'm going to borrow that one because that's really good. So let me share a couple of things where maybe they're not necessarily answers, or maybe I'm just kind of like opening up the can of worms and being provocative again to say, like, what about, what if, what can we do with this? For the first thing that I'm going to mention is disasters, and that's work that I've been doing a lot of over the last few years with wildfires, and it's part of my job at HUD. But I had a chance to kind of work on recovery issues, and if you look at some of the pictures here, they're pictures that I took in the town of Paradise last year. The top photo there, I meant to kind of take that shot, and I think I sent it to Eileen, which is, or to Kaz, and I said, I'm trying to capture that there's a burnt house way in the back top left corner. There's debris all over, and there's the stream that's running through the property. And I said, this is really what spoke to me about intersectionality here, is that even doing recovery is a sad thing because something bad has happened. But like the new growth that comes out of, kind of a land after a fire, is like, what opportunities do we have to kind of maybe make it better, right? So it's something to kind of think about, even for places that are doing recovery. Housing is the huge issue right now. can we make it sustainable, which is something that I think all of us are interested in. But really what people are thinking about, more people are thinking about, is how do we build more housing? How do we make it affordable? How do we preserve affordability? So that's the framing of the question right there. But it also begs us to say, where is room for our dish at that table? What do we bring into that conversation? I also want to bring up, because I promised HUD that I would do so, an example of the HUD Section 3 to green jobs thing. Section 3, and I'll be happy to talk more about that later, is about requiring jobs be given to low and moderate income people whenever there is HUD or government funding that's in a project. Usually it's like a construction project. And I thought a lot about how there aren't many of you or folks in this particular sector that is in the list of the businesses that are allowed to participate in this. So I thought, like, this is an opportunity. It may not be perfect, it may be a little bit bumpy, but isn't it worth kind of examining together? And the last thing that I would like to kind of bring up too is this COVID thing has really upended so many things, right? Not only in our personal lives and our work, but it's a way that we approach things like land use or urban planning. In the past, we would say, let's build cities and urban areas as dense as possible. That is what livable places is all about, right? We need to densify. And yet now we're stepping back a little bit and saying, well, densification may not be a bad thing. We need to, prevent sprawl, but perhaps we should be building in opportunities for open space. Those parks seem to be kind of like lifesavers right now during the time of COVID, right? So it's like, well, let's bring that back into the discussion of housing. Let's bring that back into the discussion of community planning, community development. And then for all of you, so what is our voice? What is our message and all of that? What is Green Infrastructure's message as we start to re-examine how we plan out our urban areas? So I'm going to end there, and maybe leaving it kind of with a huge question mark over our heads. But that question mark is an invitation to say, how can we start to kind of build those bridges, operationalize the intersectionality with people who normally don't really know what we're talking about, who like the jacaranda trees instead of the huge canopies, who are afraid of large trees because they're in the work of defensible spaces in their communities. So there's a lot of conversations to be had, and I'll just end there.
Thank you, Pauline. What an inspiring panel you all have been. In fairness to the last two speakers, let's have a little dialogue or any questions from other panelists, either Carlos or Pauline. I love the way that whole panel, this discussion sort of evolved with this very high level conceptualizing of what it is we're trying to do. So anyone have any comments or anything to add to what you've heard from Carlos and Pauline? I do love that word intersectionality, Carlos. I think that is a term that we should really adopt across a whole lot of activities, which is the essence of it in the first place. Questions?
So I just had a comment for both Carlos and Pauline. I thought your presentations were excellent, and I too love the word intersectionality. I think we use the word multi-benefit all the time, and I think there's something that's a bit more nuanced about intersectionality that's worth discussing and using more often. Pauline, to all of your provocative questions about how this work gets done and how green infrastructure becomes sort of more integrated into this discussion, I think that I think it's a really excellent question. I would point to, obviously I don't have an answer to it, but I think some of the work that's being done, I think we can see through CBOs. I think we can, there's a Park Equity Alliance. There's the Equipo Verde, which is the community group we're working with in South Los Angeles around our
Robin's frozen. until Robin comes back.
I'll
Rachel,
jump in.
yeah,
I'd love to hear the end of what Robin was saying.
we'll get her back.
But Pauline, one of the things that I didn't share, and I love that you touched on the green jobs. I will say that in most communities I've worked in, that's one of the first questions when listening about the project is, I see that you're working to get this project done in my community. Are there gonna be jobs for people in my family and my community? Mm-hmm. And maybe if you can talk a little bit more about that workforce development piece. And I think green infrastructure as a whole, I don't want it to be, we're having some shortage on tree workers, where there's some job opportunities, but I really would love to look at workforce development across the green infrastructure piece. So.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And let's kind of like zone in on that for a second. If we look at the climate right now of where government funding is, and I will talk kind of largely federal for now, because that's kind of, what I know best. But there's a lot of emphasis right now on the economy. There's a lot of emphasis on getting people back into work. Now, a lot of these folks will not be going back into the jobs that they had before COVID. And that's a sad thing. But again, kind of looking at what is the flip side of that? Well, perhaps there's an opportunity for us to rekey, what are the jobs that are available, and to kind of start to develop them in the areas that we want our communities to head into. So I think there is an opportunity. The question is, green infrastructure in a lot of the kind of like workforce development funding that's out there. If you look at all of the CARES Act funding, it doesn't say that, right? But it also doesn't say not green infrastructure. So I think that our burden right now is, how do we make those connections with the folks who are in charge of those programs and that funding? And also, how do we make the connections in terms of our narrative to say why that funding can be applied to creating green jobs? At least that's kind of conceptually how I see things right now. But I invite my other panelists to chime in too.
Yeah,
Carlos, can I go back to Robin for a second, then come to you, because she got cut off in the middle. Robin, you froze there at a certain point.
Yeah, it happens always when I'm about to ask a question. So I'll just make it quick. Pauline, I'm just curious from your perspective, do you see all of the wildfires that we're experiencing right now? Do you see, climate changes upon us? Do you see any of do you see more of an integration of the idea of green infrastructure as a way to deal with some of these impacts at your work at the federal level?
Yeah, definitely. But I'll tell you, it's uphill in a couple of ways. If we talk about, the issue of mitigation, there's a lot of mitigation funding out there. It comes out of HUD. We're kind of new to that space, but there's a lot of funding there. FEMA, the state has mitigation funds. And yet the traditional conversation about what are eligible mitigation projects is to me, I feel like a little bit outdated. I think that with the wildfires, it's kind of shaking up things a little bit. So I think that there is space to kind of start to update that conversation about what can we do with mitigation funding right now. I think that, I don't think there's a lot of people who are working in that mitigation space who are conversant as to the types of trees, for instance, or what does tree canopy have to do with, kind of like making communities more resilient toward wildfires in the future. So I think, and green infrastructure in terms of like, what is even the green space that is around a home, or especially if you live on the edge of kind of the wildland, what does green infrastructure mean there? And then even if there's a fire, how do we make sure that that debris doesn't foul things up for many years to come? Sorry, Carlos, I think I cut you off.
No. This is Carlos's turn now. Go for it, Carlos.
Definitely. Just kind of to piggyback on some of that is there's opportunity obviously with conservation corps, and they're a great tool for some of this workforce development, right? And the youth that they involve, the young adults that they involve. And there's also opportunities within folks that are coming from the prison system, you know, and folks that need jobs, that are re-entering back into society, and have hard times in looking for work. So there's opportunities in that, and partnering with organizations that target that group and want to develop them. You know, through our work in, while I was at Tree People, we had several thousands of trees to plant, and we worked with Chrysalis, an organization that specifically hires homeless or folks who are recently incarcerated, to support some of the tree planting efforts, providing jobs, but also engaging them and giving them a sense of empowerment and community and healing back towards the some of the damage that might have been created. And also, you know, engaging, you know, we talked about engaging or working with different funding buckets around green infrastructure and workforce, but also on the community engagement side. You know, looking at ways that mental health or health providers, health agencies, they have been funding education and engagement for decades, and have a really good system. So it's like, how do we tap into those resources so that there is funding, there is promotoras, promotores, there are people that can be paid to support green infrastructure through possibly their health focused lens. So also looking at that workforce development at upfront through community engagement.
Thank you. I tell you what, let's, we have about 10 minutes until Supervisor Kuehl is expected to be arriving. Let's open, what I'd like to do now is kind of just open it to all panelists and a general Q&A, but I would like to take the 10 minutes to see if we can give the participant questions a little profile here. And I'll ask Eileen if you could sort of curate those questions for us and direct them to panelists.
Yeah, so I think that we're kind of starting to get into the dialogue that we thought we wanted, you know, we were trying to get to, and so this is all great. There's a lot of different threads we could follow and pull on and see where it goes. The one thing that is this common thread through all of the presentations and the panelist comments is the listening, the active listening, and like, what do we do with what we're hearing, and what does that look like? So there's one question that is asking, you know, are we effectively learning from the communities about their strengths and listening to their expertise and about their community, and making sure that we're bringing that into? And so I pose to you, I'm pretty sure all of you are doing that, but maybe we can add to that question, how are you doing that? What have you found to be effective and a successful approach to that, especially in light of where we're at now with the pandemic? We're in, I call it pandemic mode, and we need to find different tools of engaging and being inclusive and bringing all those voices to the conversation. So how is that working for you? How are you doing that? And let's see what we're learning, what we can learn from you. Brian?
Yeah, a good question. And I think this goes to like, why is community engagement even important? Like, if we back up, you know, that there's so much buzz about this now, right? And so much focus to do it right. But I think we should just talk about what happens when it's not done well, or, you know, done in a low quality way. And I think so many of us have either been in meetings where an opinion is shared, but it goes nowhere. So it either wastes community time or, you know, doesn't inform a project. And on the flip side, when engagement is really done well, projects come out that are culturally sensitive, they respond to actual community needs, and many of those needs can't surface unless a real engagement process happens. So one example, we were just engaged with the city of Baldwin Park, which is a very hardcore community, and they've asked us to think about being part of an in-person park planning project for Prop 68 in November. Like, I was a little surprised because of COVID, but someone asked about this in the Q&A, and I shared a PDF. The state actually has COVID guidelines for in-person workshops because they kind of are stating that, you know, obviously in-person is obviously still going to get better engagement than a Zoom meeting or something. So we're seeing how that could be done with like dispersed stations and boards and things like that. But in this situation, it's a park expansion, and the city is pretty on a good page about wanting to just welcome all types of ideas from the community, because otherwise there's a very limited set of ideas put out there, and that's just not enough if no one knows what the community really wants. So I think that's the goal for sure.
And I'll add, one of the reasons I worked at Koreatown Youth and Community Center in between Tree People and the city, and one of the things I really liked about that organization, it's a multi-service organization that's not focused primarily on environmental work. It's youth and family services first, and they have an environmental services department that looks at graffiti removal, tree planting, tree maintenance, those kinds of things. And so we were able to meet a lot of community needs, or meet community members who were receiving other services, whether it was mental health or after school programming or financial coaching, and engage them in environmental topics while they were having some real like tangible needs met. But I think that all of us can be working with partners really effectively to kind of broaden what we do, and we hear things from neighborhoods. And I think to the question of playing to community members' strengths, it again talks about whether that's leveraging them through, you know, again, a role to play in terms of work with the project or helping to advise certain components, but all those things take time and resources, which goes back to this question around funding for community engagement that's really authentic and thorough, and having the time to engage partners that can bring in services that you can't provide, which again, I'd plead to the group, when we're building projects, include that as the budget that you need, so that we start having funders really understand the true cost of engagement for these projects, and not kind of going, well, we'll make that happen. What we've got. We need to consistently be saying, we need more funding for engagement in order to really leverage community resources and provide services and bring them, you know, have them be part of these project development.
So Rachel, can I follow up on this question as to how important is it for the long-term success of the green infrastructure we provide that it's owned by the communities where it exists? We always give a lot of talk about well, what's the maintenance cost of these trees, or what are the maintenance costs? So who's going to take care of this? But is there not a even more important level of community ownership that's needed to prevent these investments just sort of not being appreciated, and consequently not providing all the benefits we hope for?
Well, I actually think that Eileen or someone from Council for Watershed Health might be a really good person to answer that question when we think about Elmer Avenue, and because a lot of green infrastructure projects are just reaching kind of a mature age. I think we're still, but I would, you know, the one thing I think about is that the projects that we build need to reflect what feels like home to the communities that we are doing those projects in. But Eileen, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, we're still learning from Elmer Avenue. The picture behind Paul is of Elmer Avenue, and it doesn't look like that today. Although we were out there recently to just kind of see things, and it's 10 years old. And we need to be thinking about the long term of these projects. We're not designing for this year or even in 3 years when we know we have to do that final report for that funder, right? We really need to be thinking about 25 years out at least, because we've got these big trees that are going to be big canopies in our neighborhoods, and we need to be thinking about that. And it goes back to the conversation you all were we were having around this long-term engagement with the community beyond the construction and that ribbon cutting. And I want to bring it back to you, Robin, around Urban Orchard, because there's a couple of questions in terms of the specific types of outreach that you've been doing, and what was that like? What were those? Specifically, like how you got the word out was one question, And then some of those constraints in terms of the design, how did you handle that with the community? If they're wanting one thing and you can't really provide that because it's either infeasible or there's a constraint there that just can't be addressed, how did you, how did you manage that? And maybe others can kind of chime in as well.
Sure. Well, first, I do really want to say one quick thing about the long-term engagement for maintenance. I think it speaks to, as difficult as it is to get money for outreach, it's even more difficult to get money for maintenance. Mm-hmm. And it's critical. It's just as critical as the outreach piece because your project is only as good as the maintenance it receives. So I think I'll just put that out there. And that's why Measure W and Measure A are so important because there is the opportunity to get money for maintenance. But
well, on that note, I think we're going to have to come back and in this panel, I mean, we've got a lot of threads going on, but we know that we want to come back and really hone in on the operation.
Great. I'd love to be part of it because I can get on a soapbox about it, but I'll save you. Just in terms of the outreach for the Urban Orchard. So over the last 3 years, we have done over 40 types of engagement or 40 different meetings or engagements with the community, and they all are different, right? So we did focus group meetings with different small, really directly impacted communities like the Thunderbird Villas, for instance, a running group at Hollydale Park, a Native American group also affiliated with Hollydale Park. We've done, like I said, we did asset mapping. So we did tabling in front of churches and movie theaters and grocery stores that people went to very often to get their take. We participated in Lower LA River working group events where people who were getting some awareness around all the planning that was going on for the Lower LA River were also then brought into the Urban Orchard itself because it is one of the earlier projects to be developed out of that planning study. And then we've done, one-on-one engagements. We've had coffee with local residents at a Denny's on a Saturday evening, right? We've done all sorts of, and then the big community-wide meetings where we had, 80 people in a room talking about what they want. So we've sort of run the gamut because we recognize that there is really valuable information from each one of those different types of engagement. Also kind of demonstrates, again, the time and the money that it takes to do that type of work. In terms of how we got the word out, most of the engagement that we have done happened before COVID. So we were able to do door knocking, we were able to make phone calls, we were able to go in person and have meetings with folks. And obviously the old school low tech approach is our favorite because the relationships you build are the most meaningful, and just the outcomes are most productive. Since COVID, again, we are doing, oh, here's the supervisor.
Welcome, Supervisor Kuehl.
I'll just wrap up and say that since COVID, we are engaging residents more via snail mail and then also via phone, WhatsApp, and again, doing a food delivery on Friday. So.
All right. I tell you what, I think Supervisor Kuehl is here. And let me introduce myself. Supervisor, I'm Paul Brown. I'm moderating this session. I also have the privilege of introducing you, which I could spend a lot of time on, given all of your accomplishments. I think we all know what you're doing now as as supervisor in LA County's 3rd district, and since 2014, and I guess you were also the immediate past chair of the Board of Supervisors. I was just so impressed when I was going through your resume of all the other things you've accomplished at the state level, and not to mention your academic credentials. But I do feel like adding a little bit to the story. 8 years in the California Senate and 6 years in the State Assembly, first woman in California history to be named Speaker Pro Tem of the Assembly, and the first openly gay or lesbian person to be elected to the California legislature, and a professor at Loyola, UCLA, USC Law Schools, founding attorney at the Women's Law Center, and I could go on and on. I enjoyed reading your resume, and I'll advise everyone to go to the website and get all the details of the leadership that Supervisor Kuehl's provided. So with those words, inadequate as they are, I welcome you to join us. I'll just set this up a bit by saying we've had some really great presentations this morning, but one of the things that I took away from it is that what we're doing in community outreach is very fragmented. There's activities that are happening at the community level where people are advocating for projects. Then there are projects that arrive with their own requirements for community outreach. In every case, the funding is limited to inadequate, and the fragmentation of the efforts makes it harder to get the kind of leverage you might be able to get if we were to use a phrase coined by one of our speakers, if we were more conscious of the intersectionality of all these things we're doing. And that's just to give you a sort of sense of where we've been, and would love to hear your thoughts on these topics as well. So thank you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thanks to everybody for inviting me. Good morning. I have prepared remarks, and I think actually they meet some of the questions, though I think it's interesting to look at the term intersectionality, because in many of our areas, we're looking at the sort of overlap of the way in which we identify ourselves racially, ethnically, in terms of our gender diversity, et cetera, and where those overlap in terms of the kinds of service. But I think in terms of sort of the greening area, that it's also a very appropriate term, because there's a lot going on. And as you say, a lot of people are advocating with each other out into the world, not necessarily coordinated. And I won't say that the county is doing a perfect job, but I kind of want to share some of what we're doing. And then maybe if it hasn't adequately covered the subject and there's a few minutes, Paul, if you want to, ask anything as a follow-up, though it wasn't planned, that's fine too. But, it's been a really tough year. There's no question about it. My favorite holiday card that I saw when I was browsing to see what to put out that could possibly be full of peace and joy said, "New Year, question mark? Yes, please, exclamation mark." And that's just the way I feel. I already have my 2021 calendar and I'm looking at it longingly. But the year has really demonstrated in more than one way about the realities of climate change. I think many, many more people are going, oh, I heard the term, I know everybody's been talking about it, but now I'm starting to get it. And one of the things that this teaches us is that we have to do things differently. And I appreciate very much this gathering is a step in addressing the challenges in really new and very important ways. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the dramatically different approach the county is embarking on to address our green infrastructure needs. Let me start by talking about the county's Clean, Safe Water Program, which is funded by Measure W, and the money is starting to come in and the work is starting to be done. This milestone program was developed, as you all know, to diversify regional water supplies, and stormwater capture is a really important part of that solution. Because right now, before we put all of these projects into play, we capture and store enough rain every year to meet the needs of about 1 million people in LA County. LA County, as you know, has 10 million people. If it were a state, it would be the 8th largest state. Or to put it a different way, 1 out of every 35 Americans lives in LA County. Kind of gives you pause, doesn't it? But we also lose over 100 billion gallons of water each year, stormwater that goes right out to the ocean. And that's enough water for an additional 2 million residents in the county, their full needs for a whole year. Not only that, but after it rains, We often have to close our beaches because of polluted runoff, and as many as 1.5 million people get sick every year because of water contamination at the local beaches. So my office, working together with many, many of you, wanted to tackle this challenge with a multi-benefit approach. This is another buzzword, but a very important one because it recognizes that it's a kind of a paradigm shift. We want to work, as everybody's now saying, smarter, not harder. So many urgently needed water capture, cleaning, and storage projects can also add park space or other benefits to communities. And I lay this out because of where I want to go with what we've done with the last 4 measures that we've put on the ballot in the county that often didn't look like they were necessarily related to each other. But our multi-benefit approach is kind of like looking at a hologram, which I think we're going to do more and more in a virtual world. You look at it from one perspective, it's a spreading ground. You look at it from another perspective, it's a park. And even more ambitiously, we want to make sure that we're maximizing those synergies between and across various county infrastructure projects. So that's why we created WHAM. I mean, there could not be a better conglomeration of letters from our measures. It's Measure W, Measure H, Measure A, and Measure M, all of which were passed in the last couple of years by LA County voters. And as you know, water, housing and homelessness, A was for parks, and M for metro, actually transit. And so the 4 measures, we had to identify and try to take advantage of where they might actually fit together. So we began with a fundamental understanding that water, housing, transportation, and parks are actually inextricably interconnected, sometimes in ways that we hadn't really looked at before. WHAM represents about $1.5 billion a year. For infrastructure, it's all pretty much for infrastructure. So by leveraging the different pots of money across the county agencies to develop multi-benefit green infrastructure, we can actually make dramatic progress on our countywide priorities, like the ones outlined in our county sustainability plan, which is so wonderful. It's being copied by lots of jurisdictions around the country. I mean, I was amazed at how many inquiries we got about our sustainability plan, asking if it was okay to just copy it. And we said, happily, happily. With WHAM, for instance, a new bike path could also provide stormwater capture, as well as increased green space for park poor communities. Could be located along transit lines and near affordable housing. And that's the kind of paradigm shift we're looking at. And we're not inventing this. I mean, we are pushed by our community partners, by people like you saying, don't you see how these things fit together? But I also want to highlight the shift in our approach to community collaboration with Measure W, which I think is also really important. We're embracing community engagement as we never have before. And many of you will say, well, that's not hard because we never felt engaged, but we're upping our game, let me just say. So with Measure W, we established a large, quite diverse stakeholder advisory committee, had more than 1,000 conversations and meetings over the last year with cities, with business, with labor, with environmental organizations, school districts, neighborhood councils, and community organizations. We established watershed area steering committees made up of nonprofits, labor, and business, and they're meeting to help make project decisions. And county flood control is identifying watershed coordinators to educate and build capacity in communities and facilitate community engagement. You know, we need a lot of great minds to make these projects transformative. So not every community has exactly the same needs or will arrive at the same solutions. And we want community collaboration to be woven into the DNA of the projects. So these twin innovations, multi-benefit approach and deep community collaboration, represent a really promising paradigm shift in the way the county plans and builds infrastructure. And we hope it'll become a model for other jurisdictions across the country as they go forward with their own regional green infrastructure projects. So obviously it's not perfect, it's not complete yet, but we're still refining it. And I'm grateful for everybody's input and suggestions, because we want to clearly define terms, we want to identify clear metrics, but I am proud that community members are not just guiding these projects, they're actually making decisions under Measure W through the watershed process, and that's new. These are decisions. We adopted in the last board meeting decisions made about initial projects in these 9 watersheds. So many of you have been terrific partners over the last couple of years. I'm really grateful for your continued time and energy and knowledge and creativity. And thank you very much for including me in today's program. And back to you, Paul.
Well, thank you very much. Do you have any time to take a question or two? Maybe
I do have time, because I know you thought this was going to take much longer. I'm not much of a big talker in telling you things that you know better than I, which when I was chairing the Natural Resources and Water Committee in Sacramento, I learned really quickly that I was the least knowledgeable. But you do your homework and you understand your power. You have to say, I have the responsibility, I get that. So I would do my best, but yes, I have some minutes.
Okay, I will keep this short, but I would like to ask if any of our panelists have questions or comments for the supervisor. And if not, I have one, but and it goes like this. I love the integration that you described in sort of building out what WHAM means for the county. There's a lot of other jurisdictions that are also doing things and agencies. How do you see the sort of lateral integration of activities and decision-making across agencies that, while they may be in different jurisdictions, the watershed doesn't recognize those boundaries?
Well, I think it's very difficult. I'll be honest, that's one of the great problems I think we have, are the overlapping jurisdictions. We find the same thing with homeless services, or even trying to integrate parks, because we have 88 cities in the county, and each of them has jurisdiction and authority over their own area in many ways, in terms of building, in terms of parks. And we can only say what goes on in the unincorporated areas. But when the county votes on these various items, it's really county-wide. But it's sort of like with the LA River, and you look at that master plan development, where, along the whole first half of it, it's all city of LA, it runs through the valley. But then as it turns south, there are lots of cities engaged along the edges, of the LA River, each one of them, and not to mention the tributaries. So each one of them has to be engaged. And so we can make decisions really quick about the part that runs through the valley, if you count what the county does as quick with the city. It becomes much more difficult where you have, 9 or 10 or 12 different jurisdictions. So the only thing that we have tried to do is essentially bringing people together and trying to get them to agree, as with that master plan, or as with the projects that we're doing in WHAM, what are the best uses of this money. And if a city, let's say the city of Kewell, has decided that they really want to fund a park, and we say, look, we can help with that, but what about if we also put a cistern under it? I'm making this up, but or something that will help us divert the water in a different way from your park. Maybe you're watering it all the time, or now once a week. Let us capture that with some of the project money that we have. So we have reached out and asked all the jurisdictions, whether it's special tax group or a city, to work with us and at least communicate about what their plans are.
Thank you. Again, I'll poll the panel and ask if you have any questions for the supervisor. If not, I'll ask one last. Oh, okay. There, Rachel's got a question.
And Brian has his hand up too.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can't see
I'll just
Brian.
make a quick comment and then Brian can ask his question. I can just echo, when I was very new in the role for City Forest Officer for City of LA, I was, the County Trees Committee and your sustainability team reached out and we agreed, the urban forest doesn't know where the city boundary and the county boundaries are. It's this whole region, and efforts that we can make for urban forest health on both sides and having a consistent approach to some elements is going to be really helpful. So I'm really excited that we've already had conversations about when you're developing your urban forest management plan and we're developing ours, that we look at alignment on certain topics that cross our boundaries. And so I think that's the approach we have to take, is we have to have that collaboration and borrowing from each other. I love that the county, the other folks, your plan, copy it. That's what we have to do. When someone's done that great work, we have to utilize it.
Thanks, Rachel. Brian, sorry, you were off my screen, Brian. I didn't see your hand up.
No problem. Well, big thanks to Supervisor Kuehl. I know you've been a great supporter on all this work. Brian from Nature for All. One question, we're part of the Our Water LA coalition, and one thing we've seen as the Measure W process has gone is that it's challenging because the community engagement that is sort of required from proponents just isn't defined very well. And in comparison to, when projects are scored, there's a very clear rubric for water quality, how many gallons, water percolation, how many square feet. And so one of the things we're really advocating for is that just similarly metrics be developed around quality of community engagement, right? And if that could be done consistently across all the measures, then I think that would really set, the rules of engagement, if you will, for everyone in the county to be like, okay, cool. They've defined what best practices for community engagement looks like. Did you score a 2? Did you score a 5? And that way folks are rewarded for the quality engagement that we're looking for. And then they'll also budget for the funding that's required. So I think that's really the goal for all of us here. And obviously to get folks to partner with CBOs, because as we've all mentioned, that's the best way this work gets done.
It's interesting. Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And it's kind of one of those balancing acts that's always been very interesting to me. It's like 25 years I've been in elective office, different ones, and engaged pretty much representing the same area, over the whole time in different houses. And I've always pushed for community engagement, have always pushed for people to talk about what they need. I just came off of a Metro committee meeting where we're talking about Next Gen. Next Gen is a look at how people really use the buses. Where do they really go? Oh, women use it 5 or 6 times a day and take very short trips and incidentally need to get strollers on board. It identifies what is needed in a much more varietal way, but it's messy because you don't want to tell the community how they should engage. You want to listen, but I do agree. We try to give sort of technical assistance to community-based organizations to participate more effectively, but I've actually been really happy with the kind of engagement we've had for all 4 of these measures. But I'd be happy to, I took a note about that and think about how we can help every kind of community engagement be more effective.
Thank you. Eileen, I bet you'll want to make a point of, Eileen, our executive director, will want to make a point of thanking the supervisor personally.
Yes, thank you, Supervisor Kuehl. It's just a pleasure to have you with us, and we're very fortunate to have the time that you've given us. And some of these takeaways that you've shared with us have been what we've been talking about throughout the panel today. So it's great to have you reinforce those and to give us a look at where things are going with the county, especially around WHAM. It's a great opportunity for us to coordinate around community engagement to make sure that we are doing it effectively. And it's got me now thinking about sort of some of these, what do we come out of this panel with? Maybe some recommendations or some suggestions for all of us to kind of convene around and agree on how we might be able to make the process a little bit more effective for everyone. So thank you for your inspiration and your words of encouragement, and we're looking forward to working with you. I know all of us panelists are looking forward to working with the county on Measure W projects and making sure that that engagement is effective and leads to really successful green infrastructure projects throughout the county.
Great. Thank you all, and please keep up the good work and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we?
All right, okay. Why don't we go
Did
to
we
the
lose?
next slide? Did we lose? Who did we lose? Everyone? No. Why don't we go to this? That was great. I really appreciated the supervisor taking that extra time to answer some questions. I think we need the slide on move to the poster session. And that will give me an opportunity to thank all of our sponsors again. And can I confirm that we're back up in front of everyone?
We're working on that, and we'll get it up for you momentarily here.
Okay.
Paul,
Right.
Paul, can we just remind folks that because we didn't get through all of the questions, I'd just like to remind folks that we will pass those on to the panelists and we will get those posted on the website. Certainly panelists, if you have time to answer questions within the Q&A, I know you were focused in on presentations and conversation, but we've gathered all of those, and if you're able to answer some of those in the Q&A, that would be great to give folks answers before they leave today. But we will compile those and add those to the Q&A that we'll have on the website as well.
Eileen, I've just been answering some of them.
That's fine.
Yeah, I'll continue to do
And
so.
we'll go ahead and make sure that those get to you as well. We have grabbed those off site and we'll get those to you so that you'll have an opportunity to answer those. And then again, we can add those answers to the whole list of them. And there's some really great conversations going on in the chats. It's great to see that people are reconnecting. It's great to see old friends and new friends kind of participate. So we'll kind of have to figure out how we do this again in terms of getting people together and kind of collaborating. But use the chat for now, and certainly we'll kind of try and link people up if you miss an email or a chat in the window over there.
And Paul and Eileen, we're having a problem bringing the next couple of slides up. We're going to be putting the poster breakout information in the chat.
Okay.
So we hope that you'll thank our sponsors verbally, and we'll move to the breakout rooms after that.
And,
Okay, go ahead.
and just kind of, just give folks a sense of like how we're wrapping this panel up too, because we won't have the chance to reconvene the panel after this. And there's so much more to talk about.
So in that context, since we seem to have a couple of minutes here, any closing thoughts that any of our panelists would just, reflecting on everything we've heard today, any closing thoughts you'd like to share as we draw this part of the symposium to a close? Oh, Robin's about to say it. Robin, you've got it. Come
I
up with it.
you want me to, well,
Yeah,
I would just say that I appreciate the, I'll use Carlos's word again, the intersectionality of this. I think ultimately that's what we all need to be doing, is thinking about how our work hits community in many ways, and then be open to providing resources and support even from outside our own purview. So thank you for the opportunity to talk with you all today.
How about you, Brian? You're not on mute.
Sure. in the chat, I just pasted a link to Greening in Place. Folks asked for, what about displacement, green gentrification? And our partners locally here at Audubon at Debs Park partnered with some other great folks and just came out with this resource. So I really encourage you all to look at it. It has a lot of different points about steps to mitigate displacement, obviously. And kind of just following up on like our discussion with the supervisor, I think it's important for us all to think about, how do we get the stuff that we talked about put into place in policy or in these measures and funding mechanisms? Because otherwise we're stuck in this place where we're still griping about like, oh, there's no money for community engagement, or like, we're trying to do a good job, but we can't partner with the cities. And the more we can get those things set in stone in the mechanisms, that's our goal, right? So we're doing that at the Our Water LA coalition level, and the more that we can all, as a coalition, move those up to the supervisors and our officials, that's where we want to be. So we're set up properly.
Brian, I thought your contribution was really valuable, and it did strike me that if we want to increase funding, we've got to be very specific about what it is we're paying for. And to the extent that there are really defined best practices that we can use as the basis for asking for money, I think it helps break this kind of dysfunctional loop we're in, where there's money allocated and it's not specifically described what it is you should do with it. So if Robin knows what to do, many others don't, and may do something that really doesn't capture the spirit of the intersectionality that we're trying to achieve. Man, Carlos, you really came up with a term here that I think has got legs.
It's the word of the day, the word of the rest of the year, the word of the year.
I don't know, but it's one of those terms that you can hear it and is, I think I can picture that. But it's much better, Carlos, with the actual picture. And your slide was great. Let me just do this while since I'm not going to have a slide, I do want to thank the sponsors and partners who made this happen. And they include, again, LA Department of Water and Power, LA Sanitation and Environment. Oh, there we go. LA County Public Works, Jacobs, the Scotts Miracle Grow Foundation, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, Southern California Edison, Tetra Tech, CDM Smith, Stantec, Geosyntec, Kennedy Jenks, and Alston and Bird. And we thank all of them. And I'm going to turn this over to Drew, right? Who's going to explain what to do next?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah, thank you all. Great day. We just put in the chat, and I'll put it in there again because I think there's been more chat since, a link to the poster session. We'll be leaving this webinar and opening a new link to a Zoom meeting that has breakout rooms, 4 breakout rooms. So you can click the link in the chat. We do recommend copying it if possible, because you'll have to come back to the webinar to get it again if for any reason it doesn't work for you. So here it is. Your poster presenters are waiting in the 4 rooms. You'll enter a waiting room. They'll let you in, and then we've pre-assigned you to rooms. We are using Zoom's new feature that allows you to move rooms. So if there are particular posters you want to catch, just each poster is only 5 minutes long. So that'll give you, there's about a 20-minute session of posters and then Q&A after. So you'll have to time those yourself and jump around, but it does only work if you have the latest version of Zoom. Otherwise, you'll stay in the room that you were assigned. So we will see you all over there. I'll wait in this room just in case there are any technical issues. And I will try to release the mics here after a couple of minutes. We'll see you over there. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, I can't unmute. I just wanted to thank all the panelists. Have they already left? I think they've gone to the poster sessions, haven't they?
Oh, I guess I failed to do that. I apologize.
Well, I think it was implicit in your wrap up that you were suggesting it was a successful day because of them. So.
Yeah, I thought they did a great job. And people are gradually leaving and moving, I can see.
Yeah, it looks like people are moving out or moving over. Hopefully the panelists are moving too. Okay, so I grabbed all the Q&As off the, and I don't know if anybody else was doing that, but I was just trying to see what other questions I could grab really quick.
When I close the Zoom, it'll allow me to
save
the Q&A.
Okay, and can you?
But I'm glad you did that. A backup is a good thing.
Yeah, and can you save the webinar chat, because there's a lot of really great resources in there too. Maybe I should just see if I can grab it all right now. I don't know. Yeah, I wasn't sure.
Yes, I did save the chat. I've saved it a couple.
Oh, you have all the chat?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great, because there's some really good resources. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to dip my toe into the technical back end things, but I was trying to find the questions that we could bring into the conversation, and I noticed that there were some there too. So.
Yeah, we were handling it.
I knew you were.
Pretty good though. Only looks like only a couple people had issues getting in. So that
okay.
was,
okay.
To all participants for reference.
Well,
TJ
we'll
wants
add it to the
chat.
website. Yeah, I think we can add that to the website, right?
No problem. No problem, TJ. We heard you.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so I'm going to move in. Thank you, Drew. This is just, that was really,
yeah, a little glitch at the end with the presentation when Clara Sophia handed it over to me, but it went fine. It was.
Yeah, no. I actually think
they were having an issue in the poster room that I hope is fixed by now. But
yeah, and I wish. What is our start time? 11:30. Okay. Yeah, I just wish we would have had more time for Q&A. I mean, I always wish that, you know, except for that last panel. It was like, we're ahead. What do? We don't have any questions. But this panel, I mean, there's lots to go on here. There's just so much. That's good. Well,
all right, I'll see you over there. I'm going to stay in here for a little while, and then I'll jump in.
Okay. I'm going to try this out.